Let me set the stage. It's a little before 1:30 a.m., and you and your fellow firefighters are shooting the breeze in front of your station when a pair of explosions suddenly echo through the air. The horizon erupts in the direction of a local power plant, a bright orange flash tinged in blue that quickly turns into a mushroom cloud under the glare of the plant's spotlights. Within minutes, you're in your gear and on the rig, the driver already pulling out of the station as the dispatch tones drop. Little do you realize that this is the start of your last month on Earth. The date is April 26, 1986. The firehouse is Special Militarized Fire Department Number 2, and the power plant is Chernobyl.
Это ВПЧ-2?
Да.
Что у вас там горит?
Взрыв на главном корпусе, между третьим и четвертым.
А там люди есть?
Да. Поднимай наш состав.
Plans what would become the Chernobyl Nuclear Powerplant were drawn up in 1966 as part of a wave of power plants designed and built to meet the Soviet Union's expanding industrial needs. Construction began in 1972, with the first reactor coming online in 1977. 3 more reactors would be completed in 1978, 81, and 83, and 2 more were started in 82, with an additional 6 more planned in the near future, all powered by a single atom. This is U-235, an isotope of uranium. Like a tire filled by somebody who thinks the pressure gauge reads in percentages and not pounds per square inch, it's inherently unstable and looking to make that instability everyone else's problem. When the forces holding an atom of U-235 together finally fail, the atom splits apart in a process known as radioactive decay, creating 3 things: barium-143, krypton-89, and 3 random neutrons that fly off in different directions. Pile enough U-235 together, and those neutrons start colliding with other atoms of U-235, creating a self-sustaining chain reaction. This produces close to 8 terajoules of energy per kilogram of uranium that decays, which is what a nuclear reactor uses to create power. And in the Soviet Union at the time, the reactor of choice was the RBMK. The RBMK, an acronym for a long string of Russian I'm not even going to pretend to pronounce, roughly translates as high-power channel type reactor. Designed by Anatoly Alexandrov and Nikolai Dolozov, it was the grandchild of the original reactors used by the Soviet Union to supply the plutonium for their nuclear warheads, just upscaled in size to increase the power output that came with the plutonium production. At the heart of the RBMK reactor was a 1,700-ton graphite cylinder, used to moderate the nuclear reaction by slowing down the random neutrons produced by U-235's radioactive decay. Drilled into this graphite block were channels for 1,693 fuel rods containing uranium pellets. To keep a handle on the power levels this reaction was generating and to shut down the reactor in case of emergency or maintenance, 211 control rods could be inserted into the reactor. Now, there is a bit of misinformation regarding these control rods, which are often characterized as having graphite tips. There was graphite in the control rods, but it's a bit more complicated than that. The control rods were in 2 pieces, connected by a metal rod that moved them up and down. The first part was a 5-meter long piece of boron carbide, a powerful neutron absorber. When all 211 control rods were inserted into the core, the boron would cut the chain reaction off at the knees. The problem was that when these control rods were pulled out of the reactor for normal operations, water, which is also a neutron absorber, rushed into the channel to fill the void left by the rods. To prevent this, pieces of graphite were positioned on the control rods to fill that space when the absorbers were extracted. Now, there is a problem with these displacers, but we'll get to that in a few moments. These fuel and control rod assemblies were housed in a pair of steel plates positioned above and below the reactor known as the upper and lower biological shields. The entire reactor was then encased in a 21 meter by 21 meter by 25 meter steel reinforced concrete block. Operating the reactor was simple. Water was pumped into and around the reactor from pumps at the bottom of the unit, absorbing all the thermal energy from the radioactive decay. That steam was separated from the remaining water and sent to a turbine to generate electrical power. As far as non-renewables go, it was one of the best power-to-weight ratios in the world, and provided that the people designing and running that gave half a care about safety, it was incredibly safe. Unfortunately, though, we're talking about the Russians here. Now, don't get me wrong. The US isn't squeaky clean in this regard, and 3 Mile Island is already on the list for 2029. But when you compare us to the Russians, well, bozhe moi. The trouble began in 1949 with the completion of Anna, the breeder reactor used to make plutonium for the USSR's first bombs. In theory, the uranium blocks would be inserted into the top of this graphite-moderated reactor, pass through it, and be collected at the bottom for processing. In practice, the fuel channels often failed, forcing on-site personnel to clear them by hand. It's not known how much radiation these engineers and scientists received, but what is known is the connection between this reactor and the early demise of many of the Soviet Union's early nuclear physicists like Igor Kurchatov, who was forced to retire from the institute that now bears his name in 1957 due to complications from the second of two strokes, before being finished off by a cardiac embolism in 1960. Things really didn't improve from there. On September 29, 1957, a storage vault for nuclear waste exploded outside the city of Ozersk, covering a 52,000 square kilometer stretch of Siberia with radioactive material in what became known as the Keshtem disaster. The reason for this explosion? Failure to replace a burned-out temperature gauge, which led the facility staff to miss that the vault's cooling system had failed sometime in April that year. Heat from the radioactive decay was allowed to build up in the vault until the material inside, which included ammonium nitrate, a byproduct of the process used to separate the uranium and plutonium, combusted, turning it into a several hundred-ton dirty bomb. Between the plant workers and the nearby villages, close to 200 people would die from radiation-induced cancers, and 10,000 people would be evacuated. I should also note that the Soviets didn't shut down this plant either. It's still operational, though plutonium production ended in 1990. There are also at least 5 more incidents at this plant. Followed was a period of stagnation in the Soviet nuclear industry, brought on by a combination of apathy towards it by the Soviet Ministry of Energy and ballooning construction costs. Despite building the world's first civilian reactor in Obninsk, Soviet scientists found their funding curtailed. Focus shifted to designing and producing reactors for the Soviet Navy, and only a handful of experimental power reactors were completed by 1965. This is when the Ministry of Energy looked over its math and came to 3 sobering conclusions. 1. The electricity needs of both the Soviet industry and commercial use were about to quadruple. 2. The part of the country west of the Ural Mountains where most of the industry and population were located was almost completely tapped out of natural resources, specifically coal. The same went for the rivers in the area when it came to hydroelectric dams. And 3rd, the resource-rich areas of Siberia lacked the infrastructure needed to get those resources back across the Urals, and wouldn't have them for at least another 20 years. Into this energy void stepped the nuclear power advocates and the RBMK. It's worth stressing that even as it was being designed and developed, the RBMK was already an outdated design. Over in the West, graphite reactors were being replaced by pressurized water reactors. Using pressurized water at 2200 psi for both the moderating agent and coolant, these reactors were far safer than their graphite moderated cousins. Soviets themselves had their own version, known as the VVER. So why was the RBMK picked for Chernobyl?
It's cheaper.
Well, duh, but also niet. You see, when they were conducting the design studies for Chernobyl, they found that the RBMK was actually more expensive in terms of unit cost. Unfortunately for the advocates of the VVER, the RBMK had it beat in one important area: resource availability. The VVER required a pressure vessel manufactured by a single factory in the Soviet Union. The RBMK just needed graphite, concrete, and regular steel pipes. The VVER needed highly enriched uranium. The RBMK ran on the same 1.8% enriched uranium that the Soviets were already producing. The Soviets would eventually fix these problems in the late 70s, which is why VVER designs rapidly overtook the RBMKs in the 80s. But back in the late 60s to early 70s, when they needed these plants yesterday and with as many locally sourced materials as possible, the RBMK was king. There's also the added bonus that, in a pinch, you could use the RBMK to produce plutonium. The reactor even had an automated reloading arm to extract and replace fuel rods while it was still running. Unfortunately, many of the reactor's flaws could be tied to this design lineage. For starters, the size of the reactor, which is already the equivalent of a 4-story building before you added the reloading arm and all the surrounding infrastructure, made a fully encapsulated containment vessel like what the VVERs had economically unfeasible. This meant that in the event of a breach of the reactor core by, say, a massive steam explosion, there's nothing to prevent radiation from being released. The other problem was that in the rush to get the reactor up and running, they had started building the first reactors before they'd finished finalizing the design and checking their math. This meant that significant problems in the reactor core were only discovered after these plants went online. The most dangerous of these was the positive void coefficient. All reactors have what's known as a void coefficient, or the effect of a loss of coolant has on the nuclear reactor. Because the RBMKs used graphite as their moderators and the size of the graphite blocks, that coefficient was positive, increased as the reactor fuel was consumed during its lifetime. After about 2 to 2.5 years, this coefficient would be strong enough to flip the reactor's entire coefficient positive, creating a positive feedback loop that would lead to a runaway nuclear reactor that actively fought the engineers trying to control it, especially at low power levels. Now, I'm sure you're wondering with how inherently unsafe the RBMKs were, that the 1986 explosion at Chernobyl was the first accident involving one. Well, that's the fun part. It wasn't. It wasn't even the first one at Chernobyl. On November 28, 1975, workers at the Leningrad nuclear power plant accidentally disconnected a turbine running at full power while the others were already off the line for repairs. The resulting steam pressure spike forced an emergency shutdown of reactor number 1. To fight the forming xenon pit, or the buildup of neutron-absorbing xenon-135 that was a byproduct of U-235's radioactive decay while the reactor was offline, the reactor technicians removed all of the control rods. During the subsequent startup, the reactor took off on them and a localized pocket of increased reactivity formed, rupturing a fuel channel and damaging several others in a partial meltdown that forced another emergency shutdown. Officially, the accident was blamed on faulty construction and operator error, and a lack of an emergency cooling system that was added to later generations of RBMKs. But at the Chornobyl Institute, scientists were already voicing concerns about the RBMK. These scientists found themselves stonewalled by the Institute's head and RBMK's chief designer, Anatoly Alexandrov, and his deputy, Valery Legasov. Yes, that Valery Legasov, the same guy HBO spent an entire miniseries trying to paint as the hero of this disaster. We'll get back to that later. During a meeting on November 13th, 1984, the computer modeling department for the Chornobyl Institute raised concerns about the RBMK, calling it a disaster waiting to happen. Legasov flew into a rage at the remarks, verbally insulting the scientists who had made them. Alexandrov was more polite. The head of the department, Alexander Rumyantsev, later reported that the department was shut down 3 days later. The building turned into a unused parking garage. Because of the actions of these two, RBMK technicians at other plants never found out the truth about Leningrad, or the inherent dangers of the reactors they were working with daily. Leningrad proved to just be the first of several warning signs, though, as 2 more reactor accidents would happen at Chernobyl Unit 1 in 1982 and Smolensk Unit 1 in 1985. Both accidents were nearly identical to the Leningrad accident. The reactor was reduced to half power, the turbine was mistakenly turned off, and the reactor initiated emergency cooldown moments later. Attempts to restart the reactor led to an uncontrolled reactivity increases, resulting in core damage. And much like Leningrad, technicians working on those nights were thrown under the bus and the entire incident was covered up. It wouldn't be until the early hours of April 26, 1986, during a routine test, that the RBMK's flaws would be exposed for all the world to see. The events of April 26, 1986 were set in motion over a month earlier with a single decision by the 3 men who ran the plant. Viktor Bukhanov had been Chernobyl's director. Born in Tashkent and a graduate of the Polytechnic Institute there, he had spent his entire career around power plants. He'd overseen the construction of the plant and the neighboring company town of Pripyat, something that caused him endless frustration as he dealt with the overbearing Communist Party bosses and the efficiency of Soviet manufacturing. The mild-mannered Bukhanov was something of an oddity in the Soviet Union, a man who was respected by both those above and below him. In 16 years, he'd taken Chernobyl from an unplowed farmer's field to the shining star of the Soviet Ministry of Energy. By the time of the accident, there were even rumors that he was about to be promoted for a job in Moscow. Beneath him was the plant's chief engineer, Nikolai Fomin. A native Ukrainian, Fomin had started his career at the Zaporizhzhia thermal power plant before being handpicked by Bukhanov himself to serve as Chernobyl's chief engineer in 1972. Foreman was the opposite of his boss, precise and demanding. He drove himself to understand every little detail of his position despite lacking the qualifications of a nuclear engineer. That last part isn't all that surprising, as it was a common occurrence among the engineers who managed the day-to-day operations at the nuclear plants. These men, often drawn from the conventional coal and gas-fired plants, generally lacked the comprehensive education of their counterparts who designed and built the reactors. Foreman had a capable second command in Anatoly Dyatlov. Dyatlov had over 2 decades of experience in the nuclear industry, having started as an engineer at the shipyard at Komsomolsk-on-Amur, building and installing reactors for nuclear submarines. It was during his time here in the late 60s that Dyatlov was exposed to a 100 to 200 rem dose of radiation during a reactor accident. Dyatlov and his crew were loading a fuel assembly into a reactor when something in the room started on fire. During the firefighting operations, water was applied directly to the completed reactor, causing it to go prompt critical and bathing everybody in the room with radiation. This accident, along with the death of his son to leukemia, ultimately led Dyatlov to take Brukhanov's offer to head Chernobyl reactors 3 and 4 in 1973. In 1982, he was deputy chief engineer following the Unit 1 meltdown. Like most military men, he was a demanding boss, but at the same time, he was well respected by those who worked underneath him. Underneath these 3 men were some of the best engineers in the Soviet Union. Chernobyl was widely considered one of the best run nuclear reactors in the country, having met or exceeded all standards set by the Ministry of Energy. This is why all 3 men were in line for promotions come May 1st, and why Dyatlov felt confident suggesting they perform a test that had never been conducted in the history of the RBMK before. After the 1975 meltdown at Leningrad, emergency core cooling systems were incorporated into all second-generation RBMK reactors to supply water to the core in the event of a total power loss. There was only one problem. The emergency pumps that powered this system required a full minute to build up enough pressure, leaving plenty of time for a meltdown. Nikolai Dalzal, now head of NIKIT, or the Soviet Union's Research Department on Nuclear Engineering, came up with a solution. He proposed using the residual energy from the main turbines to run the system until they had enough time for the emergency pumps to spin up. It wouldn't fully cover the gap, but it would bridge enough time to minimize the risk of a nuclear meltdown. This test was supposed to be performed during the initial startup operations of all RBMKs, but no plant had done it so far. Reactor number 4 was set to be shut down on April 25, 1986, for planned maintenance on both itself and the attached turbines, as well as refueling. Dyatlov proposed that the staff of Reactor 4 run this test along with a few others as they began the shutdown procedures. Foreman, still recovering from a car accident that left him partially paralyzed, and Brukhanov, buried up to his head in the dual responsibilities of both the plant and local party bosses, both signed off on it. The test was supposed to take place around mid-afternoon on the 25th, and at 4 a.m., the reactor controllers had already reduced the reactor's power output from its normal operating levels of 3,200 megawatts to 1,600 megawatts. After working through some of the vibration issues that had plagued Turbine 7 and disconnecting it from the reactor, the day shift was set to begin the test. It was at this point, right as the ECCS was shut down, that they got the call from the electrical grid operators in Kiev. A neighboring nuclear power station had an unexpected reactor shut down. In order to avoid rolling blackouts, Chernobyl was ordered to halt their own shutdown until after their comrades to the south had got things back up and running again. Power reduction didn't begin again until 11 p.m. that night, over 8 hours later. And by the time of shift change, power levels had been reduced to 750 megawatts. It's at this point that shift supervisor Alexander Akimov and senior reactor control engineer Leonid Toptanov enter the story. Now, after the accident, a narrative formed that these 2 men were hopelessly inexperienced children unfit to run a reactor normally, never mind one pushed to such a critical state. The thing is that both men were highly trained and qualified engineers and had been working at Chernobyl for 7 and 2 years respectively. Like their colleagues, they often worked 6 to 8 hours beyond their regular shifts, inspecting the entire reactor building and shadowing senior staff to learn everything they could about their profession. Also, by all available indications, the reactor was stable at this point. Before anybody brings up xenon pits, let me just say that that wasn't a problem at this point. After depowering for 19 hours, the reactor had already burned off all the excess xenon that had been built up in the core and was keeping pace. Power would continue to decrease to 200 megawatts, still contrary to the theory that Toptanov couldn't handle his job. Dyatlov would later say that he had ordered the power reduction to prevent an automatic shutdown of the reactor when Turbine 8 was taken offline, as is what caused the meltdown at Unit 1 back in 1982. It wasn't until 28 minutes past midnight that the first problems arose. With Dyatlov out of the control room as he took a walk over to the turbine hall to check up on some equipment, the power level suddenly dropped to 30 megawatts. Akimov, working without any directive from Dyatlov, began removing control rods to raise the power back up to 200 megawatts, doing so at about 1 in the morning. With that problem sorted out, preparations began to perform the reactor rundown test. All 8 feed pumps to the reactor were turned on, 4 connected to the turbine to run the test, and the other 4 remaining on external power to ensure coolant was continually fed to the reactor as the turbine was spun down. At 1:23 a.m., the test begins. Turbine 8 is disconnected from the reactor, and the control room staff monitor coolant levels. After 30 seconds and observing a 15% decrease in coolant levels, Akimov tells Topnov to hit the automatic shutdown, or AZ5 button. This isn't a panicked response to an uncontrolled reactor. The power levels have only been rising by about a megawatt per second, but rather, it's just one more step in a long, drawn-out, what should have already been over by now, shutdown sequence. What no one in the control room realizes is that 2 things have happened in the last half hour. First, all the control rods that entered through the bottom of the core have been removed, leaving a mass of water in their place. Secondly, due to the test, the loss of feed water is causing superheated water from the steam separators to return directly to the reactor. This water is somewhere in the ballpark of 280 degrees Celsius, and the steam bubbles still trapped inside are causing localized areas of increased reactivity thanks to the positive void coefficient. It's now 1:23:45, the exact moment everything starts to go to hell. Remember how I said that there were problems with these control rods? Here's where they start to bite Dyatlov and the rest of the reactor's control staff right in the rear ends. First, they are slow to deploy, taking 20 seconds to extend into the core fully. Secondly, in the late 70s, it was decided to shorten the graphite displacers by half a meter to save cement. This left more water in the control rod columns. Reactivity decreases for a second before these water pockets and the mass of water at the bottom of the reactor hit the active zone, flashing into steam. A runaway positive feedback loop rages through the entire reactor as heat and pressure build up until the upper biological shield can't take it anymore. Falling steam explosion throws the upper shield clean through the roof, and is followed by what was either a hydrogen explosion or possibly even an actual nuclear explosion as uranium fuel rods were violently smashed together, causing a little boy-style fission event. Both the north and south sides of the building are completely blown out, causing the roof of the turbine hall next door to collapse. Pieces of irradiated core cover the roof of the number 3 reactor hall, the turbine hall, and the ground all around the plant. Back in the control room, Dyatlov and the rest heard a pair of muffled thumps as the explosions occurred. Dust and broken ceiling tiles rain down on them, and the instruments either go completely haywire or simply stop recording. Kimov reported that the reactor control rods had only fallen a third of the way into the reactor. Dyatlov ordered 2 trainees who had been in the room watching the test to run into the reactor hall and manually lower them, but realized the folly of his order a second later. By that point, both men had already run too far away and didn't hear him call them back. Dyatlov still didn't understand that the reactor core had exploded. After all, that was impossible. RBMKs couldn't explode as far as Soviet nuclear science was concerned. His fear at the moment was that the coolant system had ruptured and that his reactor was about to melt down, so he ordered personnel including Akimov to manually open the safety valves near the reactor to cool it. Outside, the men of Special Militarized Fire Department No. 2 under the command of Lieutenant Vladimir Previk were arriving on scene. Few members had been awake to witness the explosion only a few miles away, and those who had been asleep had been awoken by the shockwave of the explosion hitting the station. Now, this might come as a shock to you, but despite the plant being the sole reason for the station's existence, the department didn't have any special equipment for a nuclear incident. The trucks were the standard ZIL 130 and 131 tanker tender variants that the rest of the Soviet Union used. Their turnout gear was the standard rubberized fabric that might as well have been paper against the waves of gamma radiation that the ejected pieces of the core were giving off, and they had no dosimeters with them to measure radiation. They had trained at the plant before, but never for emergency at this magnitude. A few men who had been with the unit since the beginning, and who had seen the core of the reactors being built with their own two eyes, understood what they were looking at when they saw the pieces of burning graphite on the ground around them. When younger members asked what the pieces of black stone were, they just said that it was the guts of the reactor, and that if they survived the night, they would live forever. Breivik went into the reactor building with another firefighter to recon the scene, and what they found was a scene later described by Dyatlov himself as worthy of Dante's pen. The roof of Turbine Hall 7 had caved in, and the hall itself was filled with destroyed machinery, short-circuiting electrical equipment, and raging oil fires. As for the reactor hall, there was no information about what was going on and no access to it. Radiation was killing their walkie-talkies, and the internal phone system went down, forcing Breivik outside the building to give his orders. Level 3 alert had been called as soon as Department Number 2 had gotten on scene, and by 1:30 a.m., 17 different departments and almost 200 firefighters were already on their way to the plant. By the time Breivik had emerged from Unit 4, Specialized Military Fire Department Number 6 out of Pripyat was arriving on scene under the command of Viktor Kabenok. With the Department Number 2 already busy setting up a drafting operation out of the plant's retaining pond, and laying hoses to control the fires raging outside on the south side of the reactor plant, Breivik turned his attention to the threat on the reactor roof. Fires from the debris thrown onto the roof by the explosion threatened to spread to the attached Reactor 3, and possibly the rest of the plant. He and a handful of firefighters from Department Number 6 made their way up the fire escape at 1:51 a.m. to the roof. Unfortunately, because of the damage to the reactor building's standpipe system, they were unable to get more than a trickle out of their hoses. The men resorted to kicking pieces of the burning graphite and radium pellets off of the roof. It was during this process that Breivik leaned over the edge of the roof reactor and looked down into the reactor pit of Unit 4. Inside, he found the upper biological shield leaning on an empty chasm of the reactor core. Breivik and the 4 men with him, now joined by Lieutenant Kabenok, had been working for almost half an hour, unknowingly exposing themselves to radiation levels of up to 6,000 Rodgin per hour. At 2:14 a.m., they began to feel lethargic and lightheaded with uncontrolled vomiting, the first signs of radiation poisoning. Breivik and the others were helped off the roof and into waiting ambulances, then taken to Pripyat Hospital. Like the firefighters before, the medical workers who had arrived on scene were unprepared for the disaster before them, and it would take hours before treatments like iodine pills finally arrived on scene. Radiation was beginning to affect the remaining crews of Departments 2 and 6 as well, as members of the Chernobyl Town Fire Department to the north finally arrived to help. Operations on the roof had been abandoned after the next crew of 2 firefighters themselves began to suffer symptoms. They included periods of temporary blindness. Below, men continued to work amid pieces of the reactor's core, and a few even picked up the pieces of graphite, not knowing what they were. Still, even as they began to feel sick, they didn't retreat. Men manning hose lines would take a few steps to the side to vomit, then jump right back on the nozzle and continue spraying water into the reactor building. Only when they were too weak to even stand were they pulled off the line by their comrades into waiting ambulances, and another man took his place. By 6:35 a.m., the last of the fires had been extinguished, and the deputy chief of the Kiev region declared the fire out. It had taken 37 crews, 186 total firefighters, and 81 engines. Dozens of men had gone to the hospital in Pripyat for radiation sickness, and the disaster was far from over. As Brukhanov finally arrived at the plant at 2 a.m., there was only one thing on his mind as he saw the burning remains of Reactor 4. He was going to prison. He made his way down to the emergency bunker underneath the main administrative building, only to find it already swarmed by the local Communist Party and KGB officials. After ordering all the department heads to be summoned via automated telephone system, he tried to start figuring out just what had happened at his plant. He quickly found himself overwhelmed by the information coming in from outside the bunker. The initial dosimeter readings of 3.6 Rodgins, the maximum reading for their low-tier dosimeters, had been enough to request an evacuation from Pripyat, which had been shot down by party bosses in Kiev. Further readings from higher range dosimeters ranging from 13 microrodgen to 200 rodgen only confused him further, as did reports from Akimov that the reactor was still intact and that they were trying to supply it with water. It wasn't until Anatoly Dyatlov stumbled in, soaking wet and showing signs of radiation poisoning after 4 hours of coordinating rescue and firefighting efforts inside the turbine hall, that the situation became clear. Reactor 4 had been involved in the explosion and the turbine hall next to it destroyed. They'd managed to keep the fires from spreading down the 1-kilometer-long turbine hall in Reactor 3, and were working to get water back into the reactor. Dyatlov was taken to the infirmary and from there to Pripyat, where he joined Akimov, Toptanov, and the others suffering from radiation poisoning. So far, only one plant worker had died in the initial blast, and another was still missing. But that number would go up in the coming weeks. By now, a report was circulating in Moscow, signed off by Bukhanov, downplaying the disaster. It's unclear how much of that was pressure on Bukhanov from party bosses in the room, and how much of that was Bukhanov's wishful thinking, but this signed report would create havoc for the rest of the day. In Pripyat, the city citizens went about their normal Saturday routines. Kids played soccer in the park, weddings and funerals were held, and the shops and restaurants were full. Other than decontamination trucks spraying down the streets and a disruption of phone service due to a KGB-imposed blackout, nothing about the city's last day seemed unusual. A steady parade of scientists, engineers, and government officials from Moscow began arriving at 11 a.m., including a commission headed by Deputy Prime Minister Boris Shcherbina and Valery Legasov that arrived at 7:30 p.m. In each successive group, the warnings of the plant operators and those who'd arrived before them were ignored, right up until their own dosimeters began to go haywire and they saw the reactor building ruins with their own 2 eyes. By the time Shcherbina and Legasov touched down, all pretense of salvaging the reactor had been abandoned. Yet no one wanted to pull the trigger on an evacuation, least of all Boris. Even as the readings in the town climbed above 2 rodgens per hour, the danger wasn't considered as severe enough to risk the political fallout of evacuating a city of 50,000 people. Regional officials in Kiev had already started gathering buses at the outskirts of town, but all they could do was wait until the order was given. That order finally came on the morning of the 27th. At 1 in the afternoon, a radio announcement told citizens to gather essential belongings and wait outside their homes for a mandatory evacuation. They were told it would only last a couple of days. None of them would ever see their homes again. In an operation that would require over 1,200 buses and 250 support vehicles, the city of Pripyat, a bustling metropolis that had been home to 50,000 people with plans to double that number by the end of the decade, was reduced to a ghost town in a single evening. On May 1st, the newly christened exclusion zone was expanded to include a 30-kilometer area surrounding the plant. At the same time, Legasov struggled with the task before him. The reactor core was still burning, and even worse, the core had gone critical again during the night of the 26th, throwing more radioactive particles into the air. These fires burned at a temperature hot enough to not just turn water into steam, but to strip the very covalent bonds from the molecules themselves. And even if this hadn't been the case, the air around the plant was too radioactive for firefighters to get close enough to reach. The decision was made to fill canvas bags with sand, boron, and lead, and to drop them onto the reactor core in hopes of smothering the fire. These airdrops, performed via transport helicopters, would continue into the summer. They were also largely unsuccessful wastes of time that only succeeded in exposing hundreds of Soviet air crews to high-level doses of radiation. It was later found that less than a quarter of the sandbags had landed inside the reactor building at all, never mind the 21-diameter reactor core. And frankly, given that these bombing missions were performed by helicopter crews flying over the reactor at max speed, as a crew member chucked sandbags out the side of the aircraft with nothing but his eyeball to aim, I'm shocked they even managed to hit double digits. Worse yet, the dust kicked up by the impacts that did land inside the reactor further spread radioactive particles into the air. Still, Legasov persisted with them because it was better than doing nothing. Actually, nothing might have been better, because on May 1st, it was discovered that not only were the readings in the reactor increasing, but that the bombing campaign was wearing down the foundation of Reactor 4 faster than it was the fires. Molten uranium and graphite threatened to burrow through the basement and into the water table of the Pripyat River. Before that could happen, though, they would have hit the flooded basement and the steam suppression pools underneath the reactor. When that happened, well, no one actually knew what would happen, since Soviet nuclear scientists had been so sure of the RBMK's safety that they never bothered to model a theoretical accident like this. Legasov believed that the resulting steam release would launch a new wave of particles into the air, poisoning swaths of farmland. His rival, Evgeny Velenkov, who had just arrived in Chernobyl to replace him, imagined something even worse. He feared that the resulting steam explosion would destroy Unit 3 and cover a 500-kilometer stretch of Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland in radioactive debris. Efforts began immediately to drain the levels beneath the reactor, and by May 8th, the water levels had been lowered enough for 3 men to enter and open the drain valves through the tanks. Contrary to the suicide mission it's portrayed as, the operation actually went very smoothly. When the 3 Chernobyl plant workers went inside, they found the water only up to their ankles, and were able to use pipes to traverse the room without ever stepping foot in it. Within a couple of minutes, they'd managed to quickly find and open the valves. If anything, the initial pump-out operations were far more dangerous, as the men involved had to work for hours connecting over 1,000 meters of hose line to move the water from the basement to the designated retention ponds, as well as repair the damage caused by careless soldiers and their armored cars on the hoses. By May 11th, the fires inside the reactor had finally burned themselves out, and radiation levels began to drop as the flow of neutrons from the remaining U-235 could no longer sustain the spontaneous reaction. Work now shifted at the plant from stopping Reactor 4 to containing what was left of it. As the reactor finally surrendered to the army of soldiers and workers outside of it, its victims were taking their final breaths at Moscow Hospital No. 6. Most of the plant staff and first arriving firefighters, all suffering from severe cases of acute radiation syndrome, had been flown there on the night of the 26th. The plane scrapped right on the tarmac afterwards because of how contaminated they were. After a few days, the men and women seemed to be getting better. The firefighters unsuccessfully tried to sign themselves out of the hospital, and Dyatlov and the reactor staff began working amongst themselves to figure out what had just happened that night. This was only the calm before the storm, though, and soon they were once again bedridden as their organs shut down. Doctors attempted every possible treatment, including flying in American specialists to perform bone marrow transplants, but it was all in vain. Over the coming weeks, 22 workers from the Chernobyl Nuclear Powerplant and 6 firefighters who had gone to the roof that night all succumbed to complications from acute radiation syndrome. They were buried in the Mintunovsk Cemetery in Moscow in zinc coffins to contain the radiation coming off of their bodies. Back in Chernobyl, Velikov led the efforts to clear the site of radioactive debris and build a concrete containment vessel that would house Reactor 4. An army comparable to the one the Soviets had in Afghanistan at the time soon organized in the surrounding area. Soldiers began removing core fragments and topsoil from around the plant with the help of heavy engineering equipment. Underneath the reactor, hundreds of miners dug a tunnel for a giant heat exchanger, though by the time they'd finished setting it up, the fuel had already cooled off enough that it was never turned on. Attempts to deploy over 60 robots to clean the most radioactive areas, including the roof, failed either due to electromagnetic interference or due to catching on debris. This forced over 3,000 soldiers to clear the roof by hand. Working in 3-minute shifts, they managed to clear the roofs over Reactor 4 in 12 days, clearing the way for the completion of a containment structure that was made of prefabricated concrete slabs. By November of 1986, the physical fallout from the disaster was over, but the political fallout had just begun. Legasov himself had been busy all summer since his return from Chernobyl. He lied to everyone he could over the next few months. The Politburo, to Gorbachev's face, and to his international peers and foreign journalists in Vienna at the IAEA meeting on August 25th through the 29th, 1986. All at the behest of his boss, Alexandrov. The two put their full weight behind blaming the operator error for the disaster, even as their own subordinates fiercely worked to redesign the RBMK and its operating procedures to eliminate that void coefficient and make the reactor safer. They knew that They were calls to decommission all the RBMKs in the Soviet Union, not just from within the country, but from outside as well. If the truth about the RBMK got out, not only would their careers be over, but so too would any hope of a nuclear future in the USSR. And they succeeded. In both Vienna and the Soviet Union, blame fell squarely on Brekhanov, Foreman, Dyatlov, and the operators. The three former were all convicted of negligence at a show trial in July of 1987, and Dyatlov would spend the last few years of his life fighting not only to clear his name, but also those of his subordinates such as Toptanov and Akimov. Even in the confession tapes he recorded before his suicide in 1988, Legasov continued to blame error for the Chernobyl disaster, his only amends towards the danger of the RBMK being that its designers hadn't made it foolproof enough. His lies wouldn't be completely exposed until years after the Iron Curtain fell, and by then it was too late. Chernobyl itself never shut down during the reactor explosion and its aftermath, and would continue to operate without incident until the year 2000. Well, other than that turbine fire in 1991. But that's a story for another day.